Good evening, everybody. I think we have a very big crowd with us this evening. We had almost 5,000 registrants for this event, so thank you for coming on board with us for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. I want to thank our insider community, Daily Maverick Insiders. There are 17,000 people in the community right now. Those are the people that keep us straight. They keep us honest. They are our stalwart supporters, and we deeply appreciate the financial and the intellectual input that they give our organization. I'm deeply appreciative for it, and thank you for your support. I simply won't be able to engage with everybody. The comments are coming through already fast and furious. We have moderators on board, people who are picking out the questions for us. So I'm going to let them do that work. I'm going to concentrate on Bill and the discussion, but we will try to get to audience questions. I've already built some in, so we will try to engage with anyone as best we can. I'm not going to introduce Bill, except to say that he is the author of Red Notice, book Freezing Order, which is all about tracing Vladimir Putin's money, and it will be out in June. I think that's something that will be read by just about everyone. And I think, like me, you're all probably salivating to get your hands on that. There are so many people on board with us this evening, and it shows that the old accusation about South Africans being parochial and having regional myopia is not true. We understand that we are going to feel the pain on this one, I think, in a vastly inflationary environment. Rising fuel costs are not just an inconvenience to South Africans. They can lead to hundreds of thousands of people going hungry at night, and real political instability down the line. And I think we all understand that this war in Ukraine is going to have huge ramifications for everyone in the globe. Russia is not just a distant country for South Africans. During the liberation era, the African National Congress was aligned with the Soviets, aligned with Soviet thinking. Some of the comrades were trained there, and our governing party is still, to an extent, a USSR cosplay supper club, even if they have more hyper-capitalistic tendencies these days. Amongst the new guard, the radical economic transformationists, there is a genuine Putin fetish. Our old head of the State Security Agency, our version of the dreaded FSB, at one point had Red Square as the icon on his private WhatsApp account. So there's some real Putin fanboys in this country, both on the far left and on the far right, once again proving the political horseshoe theory. So that's a little bit of context. This really means a fortune to South Africans, apart from the fact that this war just looks horrible from where we're sitting. I want to be explicit so that we're not disappointed off the top about what this discussion will not be. I am a political analyst and a corruption journalist. Bill is an anti-corruption activist. So it is not going to be about military strategy. It's not going to be an armchair analysis of Putin's brain. Also, for Putin fanboys, this is an adult discussion. We're not going to be getting into George Soros, into the vaccine mandates, into 5G, or any of that. If there is abusive chatter on the chats, as I said, they're moderators. No racist, anti-Semitic, or abusive comments will be tolerated on this platform. I hope we can all understand that and engage in a discussion that's meaningful and helpful. Bill, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, and what a pleasure it is to have such a big and great audience. And I always like doing things with the Daily Maverick. You guys do amazing work, going after the bad guys, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. And I just want to react to one thing you said before we started our conversation, which is it would amaze me if we still have this Putin fanboy stuff that you just discussed as of tomorrow. I've looked at so many. Donald Trump, who praised Putin earlier in the week, has turned on him. The former foreign minister of Austria, Putin went to her wedding, turned on him. I think Renzi, the former Italian prime minister, is on a board of another one, turned on him. Fillon, a former French prime minister, turned on Putin. Everybody. I mean, he is so isolated. So, I mean, if it's true that there's still the South African, these people in your government are still Putin fanboys, that's actually kind of newsworthy, because they would be the only ones left. I mean, really, everybody has kind of gone to ground on this thing.
Well, never underestimate a South African attachment to insane authoritarianism, Bill. We hang in for the long run. We don't give up easy. The first thing I want to ask you is, because you've been an adversary of Vladimir Putin's for so long, because to a degree, and certainly you haven't been predicting the specifics, I don't think anybody did, but because you've been predicting some kind of calamity, some kind of major breach for so long, how are you feeling right now? I mean, what kind of emotions are going through you? What's your intellectual approach to taking all of this insanity in?
Well, I know who Putin is in a way that almost nobody knows who Putin is, because I've seen what a criminal he is from the inside, as he's tried to cover up a murder, cover up a financial crime that he benefited from, and gone after me in the most vicious ways. And I knowing what I know about Putin from my own personal experience, I'm heartbroken in advance for the people of Ukraine and for all of us about what he's going to do in the future. There's a lot of people watching TV and cheering the Ukrainians on and saying, "Wow, they've fought off the Russians for 4 or 5 days," and I'm doing the same thing. But I know in my heart of hearts what a monster this man is, and he has no capacity to negotiate, no capacity to compromise. He only knows escalation, and he's ready to do the craziest, most seemingly self-destructive things, never to show any weakness. And so as I look forward and think about what's going to happen, I'm just terrified. I'm terrified what he's going to do to the Ukrainians, and I'm terrified where this goes after Ukraine, because his plans don't stop with Ukraine.
No, they don't, or they don't seem to. Well, who are we dealing with when we speak about Vladimir Putin? I'm talking about the system. I'm not particularly interested in the armchair psychology. What I want to know is, what are his power relations? How does his network and his patronage networks function? What is his methodology? And I guess the larger question is, how does Russian function today as perhaps the world's most profound, extensive, and dangerous gangster state?
Well, you've kind of defined it. So Russia is not a sovereign country in the way we think of sovereign countries. It's a criminal organization with all the powers of a sovereign state. So any person who enters into the Russian government does so not to serve their country, but to steal as much money as possible. I guess the better comparison is if any of you have watched The Sopranos, there's the New Jersey mafia and the Philadelphia mafia and the New York City mafia and the Brooklyn mafia, and then they all pay tribute up to the mafia boss. Putin is the mafia boss, and then like the equivalent of the Brooklyn or New Jersey mafia is the Ministry of Fuel and Energy, the Ministry of Taxes, etc. And the whole purpose of anybody working in this government is just to steal as much money from the state as possible. And they organize the most elaborate scams. If somebody is standing in the way, they use their power to arrest and imprison people. And over time, about $1 trillion has been stolen from the Russian state and the Russian people over 22 years since Putin has been in power. I guess that he's probably worth 200 billion, maybe more at this point, maybe higher than that. And then the way it works after that is that the officials, Putin and the ministers, they can't keep the money in their name, because if they did, it could be used to blackmail them. And so they have all these people around them. These people are known as the oligarchs, who are allowed to hold money because they're known as being rich people who hold the money for them. And of course, the money is so easy to steal in Russia, but they don't want it stolen from them. And so what they do next is they take that money and launder it through different countries to get it abroad, and then they keep it abroad. And so when you see the Forbes list of the most wealthy people, half that money doesn't belong to them. It belongs to Vladimir Putin, and it's invested in mainstream businesses and football clubs and in buildings and all sorts of stuff. And in addition to that, they've also created a whole sort of population of Western enablers, people who help them launder the money, hide the money, attack anyone who wants to investigate the money, whitewash their names, sue everybody for libel, and lobby for them, lobby against any tough legislation, have quiet words in the back room if there's any questions. And they've succeeded in fully compromising and integrating into the Western society, and allowing for many, many years the most outrageous financial crimes to go unpunished. And
Bill, I want to stop you there, because I think this is a very, very important point: the enabling. I know you lived for a time in the city of London, better known as Londongrad. And I would love for you to speak a little bit about how that system functions now, because I think it's easy enough to speak about the Russian gangster state as its own entity, but for far too long, that's exactly what we've done. And I think we've decoupled the connections between supposedly legitimate financial sites, especially like London, Canada as well, the United States. I would love you to speak about how that end of the system works as well, and how these two entities sort of plug into each other.
So London is to Russia as Hong Kong was to China. So and why do these people love London? They love London for some important reasons. One is because property rights are here in London, so their property is safe. But most importantly, they love London because the law enforcement system doesn't work here. There's no such thing as law enforcement. So nobody, if you steal a
that's quite a statement, Bill.
I can say it with great confidence and experience. So and my own experience was that we were tracking the money connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, and we found it going to more than 24 countries, and every country we filed criminal complaints with. And most countries opened criminal investigations. In some countries, they prosecuted and seized the assets. London, which received the largest amount of money from the Sergei Magnitsky murder, is the one country where we couldn't. And I live here, and I have good contacts here. We could never get a criminal investigation open. And in fact, we got into a situation where the National Crime Agency, which is the major sort of FBI equivalent here, I wrote to them, and I applied to every different law enforcement agency, but I applied to the National Crime Agency, and they wrote me back a letter rejecting any request to open an investigation. And then the person who wrote me that letter about a year and a half later had quit the National Crime Agency and asked me to come to lunch. And he said, I really feel bad about that letter because I wanted to open an investigation. I believe the evidence warranted opening an investigation. But I was specifically told by my bosses that my job would be on the line if I did open an investigation. And so somebody high up in the apparatus of the British law enforcement establishment didn't want to do this. Now, was that corruption? Was that careerism? Was that sort of political interference? I don't know. But what I do know is that as good a reputation as London has is totally undeserved, and it really is the money laundering capital of the world. And that is why the Russians feel so comfortable keeping money here, because nothing ever happens.
How does that extend out to a city like New York or other property, I guess, hiding havens like Vancouver or Toronto in Canada. I know there's a lot of international people on this webinar tonight, and they'd be very interested in knowing whether their own cities are at threat of becoming holding sites for dirty Russian money.
Well, so there's plenty of dirty Russian money everywhere. Some places it's less secure than others. So, for example, in America, when we went to the Department of Justice, they did open an investigation, and they tortured the Russians who were involved in the money laundering to an enormous degree, and they ended up getting a multi-million-dollar payment from the Russians to settle the case. In France, same thing. Canada was another country where we got an investigation open, but then it just fizzled out. And so different places, different experiences. But in Britain, they wouldn't even open an investigation. And so, and what's interesting about it is that sometimes the places you don't expect to be good turn out to be good. So Latvia, which is a country that did a huge amount of the money laundering on the way to the Western world, they were on such a blacklist that they were probably going to get shut down by the U.S. Treasury. They decided to go clean. They appointed some really good law enforcement people, and they actually opened a criminal case, froze the money, and then seized the money in the criminal case from the Magnitsky crime. And so, I praise Latvia where I condemn law enforcement in London.
Well, that's actually a shocking indictment, but hardly surprising for anyone who's done any work, I suppose, in the corruption sphere. London truly is a black hole of filthy cash. Well, Putin is famous as a former KGB hack who moved into the FSB and then, by the hand of God, was made president of Russia. Here in South Africa, the manipulation of the SSA, our own kind of secret service, if you will, has played a significant role in A, flushing dirty money through the system, and B, massively destabilizing the state in favor of our former president, Jacob Zuma, and forces allied with his program. I'm wondering how significant the FSB has been in Putin's rise. And I know the answer to that question is very. But how does that function, where you have officially a state security agency becoming the front line for state-sanctioned gangsterism? How does that work?
It's very interesting that because I didn't know that about South Africa. That is exactly the story in Russia. The FSB, the FSB runs the financial scams. They're the ones who run the money laundering schemes, and they're the ones who have the power to arrest, intimidate anybody who stands in the way. And that is the way in which the whole system functions in Russia. Whoever's head of the FSB is sort of co-equally most important with the head of the Interior Ministry, which has the power to arrest, and the prosecutor's office that has the power to prosecute. Those are the three ministries where the people have the most financial wins, because they're the ones who organize the crimes and can use the power of arrest in order to, basically, simple kidnapping and hostage taking for money on a very large scale is what they do. And I don't know about South Africa, but in Russia, there's some unbelievable number of business owners who are in jail. And the way that they do it in Russia is they arrest people. So the FSB arrests people and they say, hand over all your stuff to us. And if you don't, then you're going to jail. And most people don't. They end up in jail and they take the stuff anyways. And so that's how they expropriate property and assets and shares and so on from people they want to take stuff from.
Well, we haven't gotten there, but Bill, if you have a certain amount of money in your bank account, it is functionally impossible for you to go to jail in South Africa. So we may potentially get to that point at some stage, but we're not quite there yet.
Good for you.
Well, yeah, a lot of those people should be in jail. I want to get to root causes, because this is where stuff starts to get interesting. And I want to speak about the 90s and the financialization and the liberalization of the Russian system, of which you played a role. How do you feel those early years the Yeltsin years leading into the early years of Putin might have led to some of the grievances that Putin insists that he has right now. The large-scale theft of a number of Russian assets leading out of the fall of the Soviet Union, the breaking away of republics and small oligarchies starting to form in the form of satellite states of the Soviet Union. Talk to us a little bit about that process, how it brutalized the Russian public, how it might have been dealt with better. Yeah. And the effects that it is having now.
So when Russia split off from the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin became the president. And when Yeltsin became the president, he said, we want to be a capitalist country, not a communist country. And so he said, in order to become a capitalist country, we're going to do a mass privatization program so that everybody can become owners and have a financial and economic interest in the capitalism of the country. And so they set up this mass privatization program, which turned out to be not such a mass privatization program because the 22 oligarchs ended up controlling 40% of all state companies. And then when that happened, it created an unbelievable sort of shocking unfairness in society. They had hyperinflation at the time. They had unbelievable economic contraction. And so the average person was just destitute. So professors, esteemed professors had to start driving taxis. Nurses had to prostitute themselves. Art museums were selling the art off the walls. And it was just like the biggest, people were, I think the male life expectancy was like 56 years. It was just a shocking, unbelievable situation. And so it was all blamed on the oligarchs because they stole all the money and everything. There was no money left for anybody else. And so the average Russian was really angry. And that environment in which Putin came in, Yeltsin had become an alcoholic, or maybe he always was an alcoholic, but he was not well enough to carry on. And so he wanted to pick a successor he knew could do two things. One, get elected, and then two, give him a pardon that would, criminal pardon that would stick. And he ended up picking actually three people before Putin. Each of them was a bad choice, and he had to end it. And then Putin was the fourth choice guy. No one knew him very well. And they chose Putin. They've stuck him in there. And his job was, at least publicly, to take away the power from the oligarchs and bring back some order from to the state. And for a brief period of time, it kind of looked like he was doing that. He was changing the laws, making things more efficient. Then he arrested one of the richest oligarchs, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And it kind of looked like it was all going in the right direction. But the arrest of Michael Khodorkovsky wasn't necessarily the first of 22. He basically, all the rest of the oligarchs came to him afterwards and said, what do we have to do to make sure we aren't arrested? And Putin said 50%. And that was the moment that Putin became the richest man in Russia. And then he became the biggest oligarch in Russia. So the whole Yeltsin era and all the unfairness and the hyperinflation and the destitution led to Putin, but it didn't lead to him doing any of these reforms that should have been done. It led to him becoming the biggest oligarch. And when he became the biggest oligarch, there's this expression, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But that's what happened. He became absolutely powerful, and it corrupted him completely. And so, he didn't follow through on his promise to de-oligarchize the country, and as such, he just made it even worse than it was at the end of the Yeltsin era.
And so effectively what happened is that the power and wealth of the initial oligarchs like Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, and a number of others transferred over to Putin and his men within the FSB and old cronies, presumably from St. Petersburg, correct?
Well, not all of it. So he kept around some of the oligarchs who were sort of playing the game with him, and they just transferred over from being, Yeltsin oligarchs to being Putin oligarchs. And so the sort of compliant ones were sort of kept around and they were useful to him. And then he created a whole new class of oligarchs, people like Gennady Timchenko, who set up an oil company that became like the largest oil company in Russia, one of the largest ones in oil trading companies in Russia, and one of the largest oil trading companies in the world in like a matter of 3 years, because all oil had to be sold through his company, and various other people like that. And so this new oligarchs emerged. Old oligarchs, most of them stayed wealthy and continued to prosper. And then there was another type of oligarch, which was the head of the FSB and the head of the Interior Ministry and the head of the prosecutor's office. And they would often put assets in the name of family members, or if they didn't have a reliable family member, then they would put it in the hands of an oligarch who they felt comfortable with. And the amount of money that was stolen was so enormous, you can't even imagine, $1 trillion. And that's something, that's a lot of money. And things haven't gotten that much better in Russia. I mean, it's still a very hard place, really ruthless place to live. And life expectancy is still, it's not 50, whatever, in the 50s anymore, but it's, it's not like it should be. It's not like it should be for a country that has such enormous natural resources and overall wealth, because the wealth is so concentrated in such a small number of people's hands.
And nor has economic growth grown particularly fast. I mean, from being ostensibly one of the largest economies in the world, it's now around 11, I believe. We're talking about a country that is smaller than Canada in terms of its GDP, now going to war against Ukraine and mounting a full-blown offensive, at least this is the implication, against the continent of Europe.
Yeah.
How does this work? How much money do they actually have access to? If we understand that there's $600 billion in foreign reserves, if we understand that Putin somehow has access to, as you said, let's say $250 billion, Russia is not a particularly large economy. How is this, first of all, this patronage network sustained? And second of all, how is it weaponized to give gas, to give fuel to this enormous military machine that's facing off against Europe right now?
Well, so they have oil and gas. They got lucky with the recent events of the world because oil and gas prices have gone up, and Putin doesn't share it with the people. There's not a lot of the state doesn't pay for the things it should pay for, and so as a result, they've accumulated, as you mentioned, more than $600 billion of reserves. The one part of the state apparatus which is well paid is the military, and so the people, the generals and the army are not unhappy. But it's not a big economy, as you said. It's the size of the state of New York or Italy, and so they're not an economic powerhouse, and they're really not even a military powerhouse. If you look at the military budget of Russia, it's about the same as the military budget of the United Kingdom. And I would argue it's much less than that because, unlike the United Kingdom, 80% of the military budget gets stolen, as 80% of all budgets get stolen in Russia. And you can kind of see that playing out in real time right now, as they're, all these like schematics that they showed on CNN of the troops are surrounding Ukraine. And then they invade and a third of them run out of gas on the highway because they're just, a combination of bad planning, incompetence, bad equipment, or whatever. And this is. I mean, it really is sort of. I mean, in a certain way, Putin should have kept his powder dry because now we're starting to see that the paper tiger of Russia. It's not. Yes, he's got a big military relative to Ukraine, but it's kind of not highly functional military, and certainly it's. Reflects the fact that a lot of the money has gotten stolen. Well,
there's an old adage, the second you use power, you lose it. I think that's been true of the United States in a number of military contexts, and it's certainly true, or certainly appears to be true, of Russia right now. So you've given us some really nice context of what happened in the early years of Putin's regime. But something interesting happens in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where this ostensibly technocratic seeming gentleman comes out with a far more aggressive, messianic tinged idea of where Russia should go in the future. The sense that it should restore itself to its former glory, the sense that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not the end of history, but rather a tragedy that needed to be addressed. And Bill, no one listened to what he said. No one believed what he was saying. No one believed that ideological standpoint, or at least that notion of history, could actually be absorbed and turned into a geopolitical strategy. But 15 years later, those words have borne enormous weight and have come to fruition as a geopolitical construct. What do you think about how little attention the Western powers actually paid to what has come out of Putin's mouth over the years?
Well, I'm going to say something that's totally counterintuitive, which is that speech at the Munich Security Conference and subsequent essays, including one he wrote 6 months ago about Ukraine not really existing as a country and various other things in between, are not Vladimir Putin telling us what he thinks. Vladimir Putin is a liar and a con man, and everything he says or does has an ulterior purpose. I don't think that Vladimir Putin has an ideology. I don't think he cares about the Soviet Union. I don't think he cares about NATO. Vladimir Putin is a criminal, a kleptocrat, and his main objective has been to steal money. And then afterwards, his main objective is to stay in power, to keep his money and not go to jail. And so he's not thinking about anything other than survival, physical, political, and financial survival. And so when he makes those speeches, and he makes that crazy speech he made the other day in that long room, in that room with those long tables and so on, that was all. This was all for an audience. This guy, he has never told the truth once in his life. He's like the Tinder swindler. He everything he says should be discounted, and one should then say, what are his incentives? What's he really trying to achieve? And so this war is not about any of those things he said. This war is that he's been in power for 22 years. He has people, have not gotten better off after all those promises he made about getting rid of the oligarchs and so on. They've gotten worse off. And all of a sudden, all around him, the dictators are either being overthrown or attempted to be overthrown by the population. 18 months ago, the Belarus people rose up against Lukashenko, and it was only because of Putin's intervention that Lukashenko is still in power. And then like 6 weeks ago, the Kazakh people rose up and got rid of the Nazarbayev family. And Putin could see the writing on the wall. And so what's Putin been up to? He wants, as any dictator will do, if things are starting to look dicey, he didn't want to stick around to wait till they rose up. He wanted to preempt that. And so he started a war. And he started the war on the basis of all this narrative that he's put out there. And he's not stupid. He created the fiction, but he doesn't give one cent of thought about any ideology. This is purely about staying in power. And all this stuff is a pantomime, a theater for the Russian people and for the Western world, so that there's some narrative that we think he's trying to pursue. And I think it's really important to understand that this is not about, he's not some kind of, dictator that wants to recreate the Soviet Union. He's a dictator who wants to keep his money, stay in power, and stay alive.
There's been a lot of chatter about NATO expansionism driving Putin into a corner that he needed to sort of get himself out of. There's been a lot of chatter, mostly in the Western press, about the fact that the Western governments, to a degree, pushed Putin into this corner and should have been more sensitive to Russian concerns with regard to their own security and buffer zones within Eastern Europe. How much stock do you put in those theories? Zero.
Vladimir Putin started his career by launching a bunch of internal terrorist attacks by planting apartment bombs all over Russia, blaming it on the Chechens, and then using that as a pretext to start the Second Chechen War, in which he flattened Chechnya. He then, and when his first bit of popularity started wavering, he invaded Georgia in 2008. He then took Crimea in 2014 and then eastern Ukraine. He's been in the business of doing wars for a long time. We haven't provoked him into anything. It's just a total, absolute Putin made up fiction that we should not even repeat ever again, because it just serves his purposes. It has nothing to do with reality. NATO is a defense organization. How could that have prompted him? We didn't provoke him to invade Georgia. He invaded Georgia. We didn't provoke him to take Crimea. He took Crimea. We didn't provoke him to bomb innocent people in Syria. He took that decision. There's nothing that we have done in any way that provokes him to do anything. I mean, he's totally operating on his own agenda, and then convincing a few people here and there that somehow it's the West's fault, but it's not. And it's enough that we stop even repeating that. That's because that just serves his interest.
Another argument that we hear, that U.S. military adventurism following 9/11 in Iraq has perhaps given license to Putin to go it alone and make unilateral military decisions, dating back to the invasion of Georgia. How much stock do you put in that theory? And I would want to ask, just an opinion, how much knock-on effect do you think this is going to have to encourage a country like China going after Taiwan?
Good questions. So, the idea that America going to Iraq justifies him going into Georgia, I don't give that any weight. I do give some weight to a different action of the U.S., though, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So we withdrew from Afghanistan effectively because Biden didn't want to have 3,000 soldiers at risk in Afghanistan. Those 3,000 soldiers were the difference between the country falling to the Taliban and not. And when Putin saw that we didn't even have the stomach to keep 3,000 soldiers in a non-combat situation in Afghanistan, he said to himself, well, there's no way that America is going to have any stomach to come up directly against me to save Estonia when I want to roll across the border in Estonia. And so I think that if there's one thing that inspired him to do all this, it's our withdrawal from Afghanistan. And furthermore, if there's another action of America that America's taken, it was not enforcing the red line in Syria. Remember, Obama said, if they use chemical weapons, that's a red line, and that we won't allow that. And they used chemical weapons, and we just allowed it to happen. And on the back of that, Putin and other dictators said, well, America's not going to get involved. They have no stomach for any type of military engagement. We can do whatever we want. We can redraw borders. We can attack people. And America, who was considered to be the world's policeman, is no longer the world's policeman. And so I think that America's inaction is more likely to have inspired Putin than any action that America's taken. Actually, let me answer your China question.
Yes,
which is really important. China is watching very closely what's happening with Ukraine, because if Putin gets away with Ukraine, then China will do Taiwan. It's as simple as that. And I would argue that China has seen something that they didn't expect, which is the entire world closing ranks and making Putin into a pariah over Ukraine. I think that if anything, what's happened over the last 48 hours will seriously deter China from doing anything like that with Taiwan. Now, they may do it on in the Hong Kong style, however that's played out, where it's sort of
more
like
surreptitiously,
putting the frog in the water and just turning it up slowly. But this crazy sort of invasion stuff, which turns the whole world against Putin, that's never going to be played by China.
Bill, I think this brings us rather neatly to the S word. Sanctions, international sanctions, solidarity in the international community against the apartheid regime here in South Africa had an enormous influence on damaging the military war chest of the regime, and played a huge role in hamstringing South Africa prior to 1990, and led to the decision to free Nelson Mandela and to end the apartheid regime. But the funny thing about sanctions is that when you ask whether they work, it's sort of like asking an advertising agency whether adverts work. They'll tell you they work just fine. Nobody else is really sure if they do work. So I would like to know your thoughts on a comprehensive international sanctions regime. Will they work? That's the first question. And what would Bill Browder's supreme package of sanctions against Russia look like?
So a lot of people, so I had a really frustrating conversation after Russia took Crimea. I was at the European Union, and I was in the office, the Office of Russian Affairs at the European Commission, talking about sanctions, I'm trying to get them to do Magnitsky sanctions. And they were telling me the most absurd thing I ever heard, which was, they were saying, we have sanctions, we put the sanctions in place to try to influence Russia's behavior. And Russia hasn't withdrawn from Crimea, and therefore we're considering releasing the sanctions because they didn't work. And I thought, I mean, I just wanted to slap the guy. It was just the stupidest thing I ever heard. And he said it with a straight face. The point of sanctions, as you've seen in your own history in South Africa, is if somebody does something terrible, you have to make it costly for them to have done something terrible. That's the purpose. Hopefully it changes behavior, but it's a penalty. It's a penalty, hopefully, where there's more penalty to come if they do more terrible things. And in the case of Russia right now, invading Ukraine, it is such an unreasonable thing that they've done. It is such an aggressive act. It's such a human rights abuse. It's such an outrage on every different front that we have to do something extreme. And I was really skeptical, having seen the European Union and seeing all these countries, and I speak to them all the time about sanctions. I was very skeptical that they would do anything meaningful. And by the way, Putin was also skeptical that they'd do anything meaningful, which is one of the reasons that he had the confidence to do this. And so I have to say that I was surprised that the sanctions have gotten to where they've gotten right now. And the sanctions are pretty good. They've sanctioned almost all the major Russian institutions: Sberbank, Vestchorg, Surgutneftegas, Gazprom. They've sanctioned they've cut Russia off, most of the banks, from SWIFT. They're going after the oligarchs now. They've sanctioned Putin and Lavrov. Now, there's a lot of mopping up and cleaning up and tightening up that needs to be done. Like, for example, they've only sanctioned 70% of the banks with SWIFT. Obviously, the Russians will just start transacting through the 30% that haven't been sanctioned.
Give us a second here to explain SWIFT, because while there are, I would say, roughly 500,000 Twitter experts about SWIFT, it is quite a complicated concept to grasp. So that really is the major sanction that most commentators are tub thumping. Tell us a little bit about SWIFT and why it might be so effective, and why perhaps it might not be.
Well, so what SWIFT is the International Bank Payment System. So in order to make a payment from one person to another, or one bank to another, or one bank to a company, or whatever, everything goes through SWIFT. If you're cut off from SWIFT, you basically can't pay for things, you can't be paid. And so to unplug a country from SWIFT basically puts them back like 50 years. It puts them into the economic dark ages. It's rarely been done. It was done with Iran after many years of them not coming to the negotiating table, developing nuclear weapons, and eventually enough was enough, and they disconnected Iran from SWIFT, and it was just a devastating thing. So the idea of doing that to Russia is a commensurate response to this terrible atrocity which created. But it hasn't been done to the extent that it needs to be done, because if you say only 70% of the banks can't transact, there's still 30% of the banks that can. And so if you're a rational Russian, you just move everything over and use that loophole, which, and by the way, why is it only 70%? Because there were some ugly backroom compromises and negotiations where some European head of state who was looking after some interest negotiated that. And so that's a big flaw in the system that needs to be corrected. And it will be corrected for sure, because Vladimir Putin is going to do something even more outrageous tomorrow or the next day or the next day after that, which will provoke an even angrier response from the Western world.
Well, that's not a particularly happy thing to hear. Before I open to the floor, and I am going to get to questions from the floor. Very quickly, Bill, if you could explain to us why the Europeans might be reluctant to use the nuclear sanction option, and I use nuclear here obviously metaphorically, because of the risks, the rather foolish risks that they've allowed themselves to be open to with regard to their energy security and how much energy they procure and from Russia and is supplied by Russia. It's
such an important issue. So like 15 years ago, Putin started using gas. Yeah, so just a bit of background. Russia makes a lot of gas. I think they're responsible for like 35% of the world's natural gas reserves. They produce a lot of gas, and during the entire Cold War, they always sold the gas supplies were always flowing efficiently and uninterrupted. And then about 15 years ago, Putin starts using gas as a weapon against Ukraine, as a weapon against other countries. And that was the moment in time when any reasonable person would have said to themselves, this is not a good, reliable partner. It may be more expensive, but we should build the infrastructure and diversify away from these people so they can't have this leverage over us. But instead, a bunch of European countries, Germany particularly, became more dependent on Russian gas. And there's no mystery to this. The German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, as soon as he quit being Chancellor, he went and worked as a director for Gazprom subsidiary that made the pipeline flowing into Germany and getting paid hundreds of thousands, if not millions of euros a year. And he's since gone on to become a board member of Rosneft, and he was just nominated for the board of Gazprom. And so a small group of people in Germany have hijacked the national security of the country for their own personal financial interests. I was looking at a picture today of German people in Berlin demonstrating in support of Ukraine, and the number was just gigantic. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder how many of these people are wondering about their politicians who got them hooked on Russian gas and why they did that. And now here's where we are.
Well, I really hope that connection is made. I know here in South Africa, there's enormous concern about the petrol price, enormous concern that the price of Brent crude oil will go even further through the ceiling. It has enormously destabilizing effects for a country like ours, where so much of the population lives on the poverty line. That even small increases in prices can lead to immense instability and enormous hunger. So it's something that is of huge concern in a developing nation like South Africa. But Bill, I'm going to open it up to the floor right now, and there's a really good question here from Tim Gaunt. How much support does Putin actually have in Russia? It's difficult to believe the figures that come out of the country. How do we gauge how popular he is, given that that the elections are fraudulent, and it's so difficult to get proper data out of the country with regard to this kind of thing?
Well, first of all, you can't believe any opinion poll in Russia, because why would anyone be honest with an pollster to say, if you get into trouble for being against Putin, why would anyone tell a pollster you support Putin? I think that the best way of measuring his popularity is to look at how angry he gets at any kind of dissent. So, a genuinely popular leader will be happy to have people barking at him because the most people like him. But in Putin's case, He kills, like Boris Nemtsov. Today's the 7th year anniversary of Boris Nemtsov's assassination. He was an opposition politician to Putin. He was killed in front of the Kremlin. Alexei Navalny is an extremely popular opposition politician. Putin tried to kill him with Novichok, didn't work, and they ended up arresting him and sticking him in jail. Garry Kasparov's another opposition politician who they told was they were going to arrest, and he went into exile. And so Putin is not, and he can't stand anyone who says anything bad about him, anyone who demonstrates against him, any journalist who writes about him. They all get thrown in jail, fired from their jobs, arrested, etc.
Or killed.
Or killed, of course. And so that tells you that the guy is not really popular. But it doesn't. He's not really worrying about winning the hearts and minds of people. He's running an authoritarian / totalitarian regime where it doesn't really. He doesn't want people all rising up against him, but he doesn't have to have people like him. They just can't be organized in their dislike of him. And so it doesn't really matter to him whether people are happy or sad. For example, he's probably okay with all these global sanctions against his country because it just hurts the people. He's fine. He's not okay when his own money gets sanctioned, which is about to start happening. And so his whole thing is just trying to avoid overthrow, not get elected in a democratic contest, because there's no democratic contest.
Sure, and here's a great knock-on question from Jim Miller. Is it now possible that Putin has exacted so much cost, especially for Ukraine, but also for Russia, to have vastly reduced his chances for political survival? And I'd add a sort of addendum to that question. What does political survival for Putin, what is it premised on?
Well, Putin's main objective is to stay in power until the end of his natural life. So he can't lose power, because if he loses power, he's committed so many crimes, he'll go to jail, he'll lose his money, and he'll probably die. So Putin's whole objective is to stay in power until the day that he has a stroke or a heart attack at 86, and that's the end of the story. That's what he really wants. And so will this make him more or less likely to do that? I think he's kind of of the mindset that he had to do this. Remember, I told you about the stuff going on in Belarus and Kazakhstan. He thinks that was going to happen to him. And so he's ready to do anything for that not to happen to him, including invading a neighboring country. And I see on the chat, there's a bunch of people asking about nuclear war. It's not inconceivable to me that if Putin thought his best chance of staying in power was to to set off a nuclear bomb, he would do that. I don't think that he would. I don't think that he has the reservation about doing that, because he's really a sociopath. He's not he's not a guy who cares about anything other than himself.
Here's a question from Karen Koch. Will Putin blackmail the West with the threat of further damage to Chernobyl? And I guess the question, and I'd like you to build on it a little bit more, is the threat of some kind of nuclear conflagration a real threat?
Yeah, it's a real threat. Vladimir Putin is a man who can't back down, who only escalates, who knows no boundaries, and is there he's not acting in his national interests, but his own personal interests. And if nuclear war or nuclear leak or whatever is the way in which he wants to achieve that, then he will. I don't think it's a high likelihood in the very short term, but I think it's a possibility in the medium term. And it's something that, we should have all thought about when everybody was appeasing him for 20 years, hoping that he would just go away.
Well, he hasn't gone away. That's for certain. A question here from Douglas Bookless, who appears to be a betting man. I predict that the oligarchs are going to topple Putin next Wednesday or Thursday. It is that bad. Your comments. Next Wednesday or Thursday?
Well, it's definitely that bad, and it would be nice if the oligarchs did, but I don't think that's going to happen for one simple reason, because Putin is not a guy. So the oligarchs don't have any power. They're all totally, dependent on him, and he's busy he's a paranoid man who's been looking for any kind of dissent, for any kind of treachery, and he looks for it in even places where it doesn't exist. And so he's actively looking at all these people, and the first sign of anything like that, and he'll just liquidate these people. There's just no chance that he's ever going to be overthrown by the oligarchs.
What is the way out of this crisis? Well, as we head to the end of this talk, what is the way out of this crisis? Is there a logical way out of this crisis? Is there a rational end to this madness?
The only way that I can see that the crisis ends is a frozen conflict. In other words, I don't think Putin can never show weakness. He can never back down. And the only thing we can do is stop him from escalating and keep him engaged in something which there's sort of no natural ending to. And so that's there. I just cannot imagine a scenario where he ever says, okay, let's have a peace treaty and we all go back to our respective countries and enough is enough. Because if he did that, he would be showing weakness. And if he shows weakness, then somebody will take over from him and oust him, which is what he's most afraid of.
So do you see some kind of provisional split of Ukrainian territory? Do you see Russian forces moving in there semi-permanently? What would that sort of frozen conflict look like, and how severe would the consequences be for the people of Ukraine and I suppose Russians?
We saw a dress rehearsal of this whole thing for the last 7 years. Russia has invaded eastern Ukraine 7 years ago, and they took small parts of the territory, and it was a frozen conflict where the battle lines were drawn, and the Ukrainians were firing at them, and they were firing back at the Russians were firing back at the Ukrainians, and that was that. I don't know exactly what it looks like because we have to see how it all plays itself out. But the Ukrainians are certainly putting up a more fierce fight than anyone anticipated. But at the same time, the Russians have overwhelming firepower, and we're just at the very beginning of this whole thing. I mean, my sense is that Vladimir is going to get more and more desperate to show his superiority in Ukraine, and the more he gets fought off, the more he's going to escalate. And they've been, by Russian standards, pretty restrained so far compared to what they did in Syria and Chechnya. I mean, there's so many deaths in those places and so much destruction. That's all sort of precedent that there's no reason why he wouldn't repeat in Ukraine. And so I think we have to kind of brace ourselves, emotionally for what's to come. And it's not a very pleasant prediction, but I'm sad to say that that's the most likely set of outcomes in the near term.
And just a final question from the floor from Delwyn Eggers: does the Ukrainian people, does Ukraine actually have the resources and the capacity to withstand the Russian onslaught? I think you sort of answered that, saying that right now they seem to be fighting with one hand tied behind their back. Were they to unglove, perhaps things would get much, much worse.
Well, no, I mean, I think that the Ukrainians are now getting, I mean, the Germans who like would only supply them 5,000 helmets 3 weeks ago are now supplying them with, air-to-air missiles and all sorts of really great stuff. And so, yeah, they're getting a lot of resources now. The whole world's behind them. I think that, Putin really did himself a disservice by, getting the whole world on their side. And it's not a fair fight, but it's, when people are fighting for their home, for their freedom, and for their families, they're a lot more motivated than a bunch of conscripts who are sent into a war they don't understand. And so it's, even with one hand tied behind their back, the Ukrainians are doing a pretty good job.
Well, Bill, look, thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. I think it's been invaluable. I've certainly learned a fortune, and I really do hope our, everybody in the audience has. I think it's by far the biggest audience. I'm not sure that DM has had, but certainly close to it. A reminder to the people on the call, please do consider joining the Insider program. We are anti-corruption fighters. That's what we do, but it is not cheap, and while engaging with our material is free, it is certainly not free to produce. So I do urge you to consider becoming an insider. We need you, and I would like to think that you need us. As far as Bill's concerned, please do grab his book, Red Notice. It is an absolutely sublime education on what Russia has become under Vladimir Putin. And his new book, Freezing Order, which is all about tracing Vladimir Putin's money, will be out in June. Pre-order at your favorite online bookstore, preferably an independent bookstore, of course. And that will be in your inbox in June, I believe. Bill, once again, thank you so much. Thanks again to our audience. You've been amazing. And hopefully we see you soon, Bill. Maybe we can even touch base again if this thing continues.
Absolutely. You keep up the good work, and thank you for all you're doing, and great conversation.
Thanks, Bill.